I think we can begin in 2 minutes.
Okay, the live stream is on. So here's the link. I'm going to send it to everyone just in case. And I'm gonna just, before forgetting, I'm gonna start the recording.
Okay, I think we can begin actually. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rojin Mukriyan, and I would like to welcome you all to the panel discussion organized by Jîna Academy. Our panel discussion entitled Rojava Under Attack, Autonomy, War, and the Regional Crisis. Today, I have the honor to moderate this timely discussion. First, before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping rules. The first thing is to note is that this panel is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube channel, and later also will be uploaded on Jîna Academy's YouTube channel and on X and Instagram account of Jîna Academy. The panel is scheduled for 90 minutes also. We have 3 distinguished speakers today. During the first 40 to 50 minutes, I will ask each panelist few questions. And then later we have 40 minutes, which is allocated to Q&A. Feel free to drop your question in the chat box or later in the Q&A session. Raise your hand and we will be happy to bring you in for discussion. But before to start and go to our panelists, I would like to ask Dr. Sardar Saadi, the Executive Director of Jîna Academy, to give us a few words regarding Jîna Academy and its activity. Thank you. The floor is yours, Dr. Sardar.
Gelek spas. Thank you so much, Rojin. Hello, everyone. Rojbash, Beanibash, Nevarobash, Evarabash, and Bakhiratan. Welcome. Thank you for being with us today here. We are gathering today because Rojava is under attack. And again, since 2012, since the inception of the Rojava Revolution, it has come under several attacks, many of them existentials. But this moment is very different, very special, and it demands more than silence. It demands more than waiting for things to become clearer or settle. What is unfolding in Rojava, in democratic autonomous northeast Syria, is an existential threat to a political and social project that has mattered far beyond its borders. A project built around self-governance, around women's liberation, communal life, and the possibility of organizing society otherwise. And all of that in the middle of a region shaped by war and authoritarianism. Here at Jîna Academy, we are proud to continue the educational, pedagogical, organizational work around these very important issues. Jîna Academy was created precisely for moments like this. It grows out of years of collective experience working with alternative and grassroots educational projects, including the establishment of the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Rojava, long-term collaborations with universities in autonomous Northeast Syria, and solidarity-based academic work across Kurdistan and beyond. Many of us here have learned, taught, and struggled together in these spaces. This academy is not abstract for us. It comes directly from those shared histories, friendships, companionships, comradeships, and political commitments. We are here today not only to analyze what is happening in Rojava, but to understand why it is targeted, how regional and international powers are entangled in this war, and what the destruction of what the destruction or survival of Rojava would mean for struggles over dignity, over autonomy, and collective life well beyond Syria, well beyond the region. This is about more than one place. This is about whether experiments like this are allowed to exist at all. I'm really grateful to our speakers and to our moderator joining us from Amargi and from Jîna Academy. We are here together. All of the people that you're seeing, they are also part of, in one way or another, the fantastic the Amargi publication that also kind of new. It was born during the same time that the Jîna Academy started. And they joined us on such a short notice. And we are very thankful for them to bring their insights, experiences, and clarity to this conversation. And I'm grateful to all of you taking the time to be here, to listen, to think together, and to stay engaged at the moment when disengagement can feel tempting, but it is costly. And with that, let me hand it over back to our moderator, Rojin, to begin the panel. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you so much, Sardar. Thank you. I think Sardar put us in the right place to actually start our discussion, and I will start with Elif. Elif Sarican is our first panelist. She is a writer, editor, and translator who works with cultural and educational institutions around the world, and she is the host of the Amargi Mosaic. Welcome, Elif. I think, Elif, what Sardar has just mentioned, it's with most of us. When we talk about Rojava, it's kind of a known place for many. For many of us, it is a place, the geography in the Middle East, in Northeast Syria. Many people globally know Rojava. Many knows it as a place which is resisted the Islamic State forces. So it is just, for them, Rojava resembles kind of resistance and struggle against some dark terrorist fighters. But for many other, Rojava is a place where actually dystopia began, transform into a grounded utopia. It is a place that gave actually a chance for many suppressed possibilities to have a moment of realization. And what again Sardar said, this is known for its attempt to actualize the idea of democratic federalism formulated by Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is based on local direct democracy, based on gender emancipation and ecology. And this attempt by Rojavan people, which is the home for Kurdish majority people, but at the same time also home to other ethnic groups, has been always under threat from Turkey, from Damascus government. Before December 2024, it was Syrian, it was Al-Assad regime. Now it is Ahmed al-Shara and its forces, Hayatul Tahrir al-Sham. I would like to ask you if you give us a brief historical background of the Rojava revolution, how they manage collective life, how they could manage just living while facing all these different threats coming from Turkey, ISIS, Damascus. Yeah, it would be great to start from here.
Thank you so much, Rojin, and thank you to the Jîna Academy for hosting such a conversation, and thanks Sardar as well. Yeah, I really look forward to hearing insights from everyone else as well, from Saeed and Kamal and so on. So I think the question of, Rojava's relevance beyond its borders, I think is a really crucial question. And actually, I think also comes into talking a bit about, I suppose, the brief history and so on. So I think, I'm not sure, you know, those who are listening, what the kind of understanding of it is, and I don't want to do the kind of usual spiel about, you know, democratic confederalism and so on, because you've also spoken a little bit about it now, Rojin. But I think the importance, or to situate the understanding of the brief history of Rojava, it's also important to understand the territory that we're speaking about, right? You know, the territory, whether we're talking about the north of Syria, which has been, you know, the territory that's been called the Autonomous Administration, or the surrounding territories, have, you know, witnessed some of the most seismic happenings throughout civilization, right? You know, many people call it kind of like the cradle of civilization. It's also been home, or at least adjacent or neighbors to many realities like the Armenian genocide, and obviously other attempts at you know, different forms of Kurdish self-determination, whether we talk about the Mahabat Republic, or other attempts and experiments, like, you know, across the contemporary borders in Turkey and so on. So I think it's very important that we understand the territory that we're talking about and how significant it has been throughout civilization, to understand how significant what we're witnessing now is. And many people, again, as you said as well, Rojin, probably would have heard about Rojava and the Rojava Revolution, or the people there, the fight there. You know, many people would talk about the bravery of the women and people there in the fight against the so-called Islamic State. Now, of course, this was a very significant you know, part of particularly the last 14 years. But I think what people sometimes miss is the attempt, and particularly the declaration of the Rojava Revolution came about before then. And actually, I think if we start understanding the advances and the attacks of the so-called Islamic State against Rojava in this context, we can also understand better what is happening today with the developments that are being, you know, kind of represented by Ahmed al-Shara, but also with the different forces that are involved in it, right? So I think, so if we understand that, you know, the Rojava Revolution was declared formally in 2012, the kind of, I suppose, the you know, it was being prepared, or the foundations for it to be declared was being prepared, particularly since 2011, after the war in Syria broke out, and particularly when Assad's forces, you know, withdrew to the south of the country. But the foundations, the political, ideological, and very crucially, the societal foundations of the Rojava Revolution was being prepared from, you know, all the way from the 80s, when the Kurdish freedom movement also had its first experience of talking to different sections of Kurdish society throughout Syria. And when I say Syria, I mean that deliberately, and not just Rojava and the north of Syria, but also, you know, Kurdish communities in Aleppo and even in Damascus and other parts of Syria as well. And also the Kurdish movement's experience in building relationships with other communities in Syria as well. Again, from, you know, Arab communities to Armenians, to Assyrians and so on. So I think to understand the happenings and the kind of development and why the Rojava Revolution was even possible, we need to understand those relationships that had already been formed from the 80s onwards, as you said, particularly led by Abdullah Öcalan, but also, you know, many other Kurdish revolutionaries and you know, what we could call actually community organizers. And I think, again, to understand the brief history, it's also important to just very briefly touch on broadly speaking, the Kurdish movement attempts that we know of, but also what we've seen in the last 14 years in Rojava are seen by many within the context of the resurrection of the Kurdish nation. And when we talk about resurrection, once again, the significance of the territory we're talking about also comes into play, in that, you know, particularly at the turn of after World War One, and, you know, I don't need to get into the details of it. I imagine many people would know about it, but, you know, when the region was being redesigned. The redesign, as we now know, a very central hub of it was Syria, and so the resurrection, quote unquote, of the Kurdish people is also in the context of, you know, the nation state project in the Middle East, which necessitated essentially the cultural identity, political and societal death of an entire nation. So literally just to exist as physiological beings, and nothing more. So I think, you know, I imagine we'll talk a bit more about, you know, what the aim was and perhaps what it means, the meaning of it and what it represents, the Rojava Revolution. But I think to just briefly situate it, I'll probably stop there.
Thank you so much, Elif, for that. Our second panelist is Kamal Chomani. He is a PhD candidate at Leipzig University and the editor-in-chief of the Amargi. Welcome, Kamal. Actually, what Elif mentioned, our picture, which is the continuity within the Kurdish struggle that finally found a ground in northeast Syria to actualize itself, to ground itself. But that in practice is facing an existential threat right now. And I think it's good to ask you, like, what do you think about the agreement which is signed on 30th of January between Ahmed al-Shara and Commander-in-Chief Mazloum Abdi? Based on this agreement, yes, we see some recognition of the existence of Kurdish people. We see that the Kurdish language has been recognized as a national language, and this is some sort of can be labeled as victory for the Kurdish people, comparatively speaking. If we compare the status of the Kurdish people right now with what they had during the al-Assad regime. But however, there are many points that leave some ambiguity and uncertainty when it comes to the existence of the autonomous region of Rojava. Could you explain that based on this agreement, can we see that the autonomous self-administration, the local administration of Rojava is going to continue its existence, or this agreement brings an end to the existence of this practice of democratic self-administration?
Thank you so much, Rojin, and hello everyone, and congratulations to Jîna Academy for, you know, we are also happy with the Amargi. Elif and I are joining, you know, the first meeting in English. Yeah, and concerning your question, first of all, you know, I think Rojava has passed the existential threat period. And thanks to the resistance that people of Rojava and also the fighters showed, and then also somehow thanks to the international intervention on another side, but also mainly thanks for the Kurdish people everywhere around the world that they hand in hand joined together and took to the streets everywhere and on social media, and they showed some sort of unity. And that was a response to the international community and also to the regional powers in the region, as well as the nation status of the region where those nations that the Kurds are inhabited, that the Kurdish nation is not the nation, is not the people that was like 50 years ago or the beginning of 20th century to be assimilated, to be denied, to be eliminated easily. Or it is foundation, it is some sort of political experiment or political autonomy to be eradicated, as we have seen in 1946 in Mahabad in Kurdistan of Iran, or in the 1975 in Kurdistan, the autonomous region of Kurdistan. So that's not the same nation. This nation can defend itself as a nation and also as military, and also as well as it is international relation has grown into a level where international community cannot stop, cannot deny the existence of the Kurdish people. However, coming back to how was this agreement between Rojava administration and also the new Syrian regime. So first of all, if it was the same 10 March agreement, I would say it was a peace settlement, and it was a mechanism of resolving the Kurdish question as the Kurdish people would like. However, things changed no matter what. Like, of course, there was some miscalculation from the Kurdish administration and also from the Kurdish leadership in Rojava. And so they miscalculated. So the delay was not in the Kurdish advantage, the implementation of 10 March agreement. However, the agreement that we have seen, it was, as I said, it was not a peace settlement. However, it was the best mechanism how to control the damage that the other side would bring to the Kurdish people, because it was the Rojava, not only Rojava, the Kurdish people and the entire Kurdish nation, the Kurdish nation, and also peoples in Rojava, those Arabs who were part of the self-administration, the Christians that were part of the administration, as well as the seculars in the region. They were at the brink of an existential threat that was coming from the HTS-led, the Syrian Arab Army, and it is factions that are supported by the Turkish state. So yes, the agreement prevented a large-scale war, prevented a civil war in Syria, but the prevention of civil war and large-scale war, it was good. It was something that we have to celebrate, but it was also on the expense of diminishing the self-administration of the Rojava that we knew that Kurds were celebrating. So as the experiment, I would say, as socialist, woman-led, democratic nation, self-administration that we knew before, I don't think it will exist anymore. However, that's not the end of the story, because autonomy is not completely abolished, and however, it has deeply constrained. This constrainment of the administration has not completely denied the Rojava administration to exist in a different name. So that's why the agreement that we have now between both sides, it is an agreement. It gives space to the Kurdish self-administration to survive. It is political ideology to survive in a different way, where the administration should be integrated to the new Syrian state, as well as the security apparatus, as well as the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. I do not think Syrian Democratic Forces will exist anymore, but their integration to the Syrian Arab Army is not the assimilation of the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Force or YPG or YPG. So they will exist in a different name. So it will be more a state sort of arrangement as we have in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where the Peshmerga, although in the Kurdistan region of Iraq we have the Peshmerga, however, parallel to the Peshmerga, we also have the border guards. So the border guards are the Kurds, but they are part of the Iraqi army or the Iraqi security apparatus. So the new SDF, the new YPG, the new YPG will be something similar, where they will protect themselves in their own territories. So one of the problems is still we do not have international guarantee. Yes, France, United States, and also the majority of the European countries are part of it, but there is no guarantees that the Kurds will be protected. The main guarantee is the Kurdish residents and the Kurdish people themselves. And I think Rojava has taken a very good lesson from this international abandonment. And another point I would say is, this survival was through compromise, not recognition. Because even the presidential decree, I think presidential decree number 13, it was something great. It was good. It was some sort of recognition. However, it has not been constitutionally, it has not been recognized in terms of constitution. So what I have heard from the leadership in Rojava is they are preparing a delegation, a constitutional delegation, experts of constitution, that they will go to Syria, and they will negotiate, and those terms of the agreement should be part of the new constitution in terms of Kurdish language, some sort of decentralized self-governing, and also including also the SDF YPG as 3 battalions in the north part of Syria. So what we have now, Rojava has entered a phase of managed uncertainty. So they managed very well, despite all the criticism that they have received, despite all the compromise that they have made, despite all the despite losing all this sort of political and security gains that the Rojava administration had, but at the same time preventing civil war, preventing a large-scale war in Syria, in which you do not know whether you succeed or you lose, or you do not know whether there will be a new Gaza in Rojava or not. I think that was a success that Rojava has achieved. I would stop.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kamal, for that. And you unpacked many different issues, which we can discuss later. And one of them is that the Kurdish forces, or to say that the Kurdish decision-making body in Rojava made few miscalculations. I will come back to that later. Our last but not least, of course, panelist is Dr. Seevan Saeed. He is an associate professor of Middle East Studies at Shaanxi Normal University in China and a member of the Executive Council of Jîna Academy. Welcome, Seevan. Seevan, I would like to look at different issue concerning Rojava and what we saw in the past few weeks. One question is, it comes to the relationship between the Kurdish people forces and the tribal forces, especially in Tabqa and Raqqa. Following the 6th of January agreement between Ahmed al-Shara and Israel, mediated by the US, in Paris, we saw that the HTS forces attacked a Kurdish neighborhood in Aleppo, and the Kurdish forces decided to withdraw. But after that, we saw some defection of the tribal leaders and forces in Raqqa and Tabqa. And that made the Kurdish forces to withdraw from that regions. And that brought a huge discussion, both from theoretical perspective, when we look at democratic confederalism and the idea of democratic nation. Many argue that democratic nation, or the brotherhood or sisterhood of the nation, or what I would like to use is the cohabitation of different nations, is only possible between oppressed nation, not a nation that is oppressed with its dominant, here between the Kurds and the Arab, which are dominant. What do you think of this? First, could you explain that what was the relationship between the Kurdish forces and the tribal Arab leaders? Was that merely a political coalition between them, or something deeper that easily basically break down? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, good evening. Hello, everybody. Thanks for this opportunity. After 2015, when ISIS started to be diminished, especially in Kobane, and then started to advance the Kurdish forces, or Rojava, I can see as a concept, the territories that were not predominantly Kurdish people were started to be under the hand of the YPG and YPG, and then the two new concept has to be advanced and has to be introduced to the scene in Northeast Syria. One, the concept of Northeast Syria and self-administration. So the word Rojava slightly became some concept within Northeast Syria, and SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, because the discourse required to have this kind of inclusive connection between the Kurdish-led YPG and YPG and non-Kurdish forces that they have to protect their own territories. So in this case, we have two different connections between Kurds and non-Kurds in the region. Those places, when we call it Rojava still, and now the concept of Rojava is coming back to us, that kind of integration, I can say, not assimilation, integration between Kurds and non-Kurds in some areas like Qamishli or Hasaka or Kobane is very successfully managed the notion of brotherhood between the nations. Most of the Arab people in Qamishlo can speak Kurdish, and in Hasaka as well. And even the tribal leaders in Qamishlo, they can speak, or in Amuda, they can speak Kurdish as well. That not because they were assimilated, that because they were integrated into the society, and it was a long-term process. But on the other hand, in some places like Raqqa, Tabqa, Deir ez-Zor, those places, it was sudden and something out of the exactly planned by the Kurdish forces when they suddenly saw themselves that ISIS is defeated. Raqqa became a defeated capital of them, and they had to manage it. While about 95% of the people in Raqqa is Arab and mostly Sunni, and they used to even be not loyal for Al-Assad regime that time. We call them Daeshi Saddami or Sunni Saddami. So they were even loyal to Saddam in Iraq, where they're close to the border. So in this respect, it was very difficult for making this kind of integration, despite the very big enthusiasm for the Kurdish forces to make this type of brotherhood or sisterhood between the nations or ethnic. In this respect, there was some kind of parallel power sharing or managing to make a stability, but always the Kurdish forces or the Kurdish project, when I can call it Kurdish project, because the main pillar of this type of idea, when we call it Kurdish brotherhood between the nations, were started from the Kurdish ideology of confederalism, democratic confederalism. In this case, it was not successful, and that's what always they were thinking, that one day they have to change this course, because it was not easy to make this long process as we used to see in Qamishlo, Hasaka, or some other places. In this respect, we can say that the project is intact ideologically and theoretically, but practically was less successful in this area. And now we can see the real core of the Rojava administration is back to its reality now. So now we can call it again this experiment that we have it for last at least 12 years, Rojava again. So Northeast Syria maybe concept is no longer survive, but still Rojava ideologically, theoretically, and symbolically is still there, despite the fact that for the new administration, some of the central system is started to be really adapted again. In Hasaka, for example, we have a mayor or we have a governor, and then some of the military construction should be part of the Syrian army. But still within the core of the idea and the practice, the ideology and the praxis of the ideology of brotherhood between the nation and democratic autonomy and grassroots democracy, and this whole process still can continue, and as Kamal said, is survived already despite all this atrocity that we have seen in the last few weeks. But what is in front of us is going to be something actually more harder. How are we going to make this recognition within this new system? Because the system is centralist system, still is a system that some people call it nation-state system, which is very problematic actually. If you call what is going on in Sham or in even Ankara, call it nation-state system. These are elite kind of groups that they are working or having their own interest based on the name of one nation. But that's dead, let alone this. How are we going to make this kind of practical integration between this administration that is trying to be rechanging the names and the forms, but still essence of the democratic confederalism still continued? I think we have to make some suggestion in this respect, that the Rojava new praxis or administration should let the state bureaucracy come back, but doesn't let the regime come back. And that's what we can see. The regime cannot come back into the daily life, but the state bureaucracy will be there. And this is going to be very difficult to manage. And how are we going to make our people, that what I'm saying, make the Kurdish people there and non-Kurdish people in the Rojava whole territories, and especially the crisis of the Sarican, Grespi, Tel Abyad, or Ras Al Ain, and Afrin, especially. Of course, these kind of three main challenges that is in front of the Kurdish administration. How are we going to make this integration while they're going to persuade Sham and every international community that they are accepting the centralist government and this bureaucracy, but they let only the system and bureaucracy come back, not the regime, because there's a very, very big difference between the regime that is in Sham and the people who are living there for the last 15 years. Very difficult for some people to be persuaded to accept this reality. And that history told us that it's not easy for someone who saw freedom can be re-slaved again than someone is already born as a slave. So in this case, we have a very big challenge in month or year, perhaps, to see what will happen. But another important thing that we can see now in Deir ez-Zor, in Tabqa, in most of the parts of under the regime at the moment, the civil war is on the way for so many reasons. One of them may be the power sharing and the tribal conflict that is there. And that will be very easy for Rojava administration to protect itself and not to interfere by all this happening, that what inevitably and compulsory has to interfere in 2015. I will say no more at the moment, and if there's some question, I can elaborate more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seevan, for that. Yes, the future is uncertain, and Rojava self-administration faces a lot of challenges. Elif, I come back to you, and both Kamal and Seevan basically talked about survival, and they mentioned that Rojava somehow managed to survive. But I think it is important also to unpack the meaning of survival. What do we mean by surviving? Like, do we mean just a mere physical existence, or do we mean something more political? So when it comes to the political existence, especially, I want to talk about the woman issue here, because one of the main pillar of the idea of Rojava self-administration was gender emancipation. Actually, one of the most visible achievements of Rojava was somehow gender equality. Like, we see that 50% quota in both top-down and bottom-up institutions. We see co-chair system in Rojava was in practice. But as we see, and as you guys in the Amargi also reported on this, already we see that women autonomous organizations in Tabqa and Raqqa now are diminishing by the government forces. I want to ask you, what is the status of Kurdish women's autonomous organization right now in Rojava? Again, Kamal mentioned that YPJ, Women Protection Unit, and People's Protection Unit will somehow continue their existence, but perhaps under a different name. But how about Kurdish Women's Autonomous Region? Like, can we imagine the parallel coexistence of a patriarchal state in the capital of Syria, which is trying to govern based on Sharia law, to accept or show any tolerance in the front of this women's autonomous administration?
Well, I mean, I think we don't really need to predict what the position of the current transitional government or interim government, whatever we want to call it, in Damascus thinks, because we've already seen quite a lot in practice, from even in the last few weeks. We've seen both reports and also admitted by Shara himself and forces from throwing women off buildings. It's still till this day not confirmed whether that women fighter who was thrown off a building was alive or had already been killed. We still don't know this. One of the things that many people would have seen that went viral was that HTS fighter holding a woman's plaited hair, and there's also already been seen the reports of men in certain parts of Syria like breaking makeup products and saying from now on women are not allowed to wear makeup. There was also, but I think there was also this for me, very interesting documentary that was on BBC, particularly based, it was a profile piece on the only female minister in the current interim government's cabinet. And, they go around with personally, I think it was quite a puff piece in, talking about the current attempts and so on. But I think the interesting part for me was also when they spoke to some people in cafes across Syria, and they say, what do you think about more women's involvement in politics and so on? And particularly the men that they spoke to, the women seem a bit unsure and say, we don't mind if more women are involved, but not necessarily saying that this seems important for us. But a lot of the men that they spoke to are saying, women have no issue in Syria. What are you talking about? We have other issues we need to resolve. So this is the current narrative that is certainly being pushed. And I think when we talk about the future of women's autonomy and women's organization, particularly in Syria, I think we also need to understand, a lot of people talk about, the Kurds are not the old Kurds when we talk about whether it's, both thinking about and resisting in terms of the future of Rojava and broadly speaking, Kurdish interests. But I think also, the world needs to understand that Kurdish women are not the old Kurdish women either, particularly after, decades of experience of autonomy, of resistance, and of not just military self-defense, but also political, social self-defense. Of course, the women are very aware that they have the most to lose, and therefore they are going to be the ones who also are going to be in the most active and intense fight for particularly the political and social future, both for the Kurdish people, but also for the future of Syria. So I think when we look at that, and I think, as you said, Raqqa is a very important place to look. For example, as many people know, Raqqa was like the so-called capital of the caliphate of the so-called Islamic State, and after it was liberated from ISIS, the assembly that was formed, and of course there could be discussions about, are there critiques to have? Was it fully implemented? Exploring that relationship and the kind of experience there. But one thing we need to understand is, for example, the co-chair of the Raqqa Assembly has already had to leave Raqqa and is in another part of Rojava, for example. And so when we think about places like Raqqa and Tabqa and so on, also in Tabqa where we saw, the statue of a YPG fighter being taken down, we need to understand very clearly what those currently in Damascus want for the future of Syria, and therefore what we also want, and particularly to see and understand what the women who have been fighting, who both fought ISIS but also fought to build an alternative system in Syria, also want. And also crucially, I say what those in Damascus want, because I think, again, what we need to understand, and perhaps we'll come into this whole narrative around we need to give up on like the people's brotherhood or siblinghood or whatever we talk about. We need to understand also there isn't a unified, even Arab vision for the future of Syria. Those in Damascus right now, those in power in Damascus have a very particular vision, but it's not like that every Arab in Syria also wants this. Many Arabs that we also speak to are saying even over a year later, there hasn't been a national conference, there hasn't been discussions about what the future of Syria will look like. So I think there's two crucial things that I think we need to understand. One is that particularly the alternative that women's autonomy represents is very much the threat of a good example in terms of the future, both of Syria, but also those who don't want this for Syria also very much understand the impacts that it would have on the broader region. And I think we also need to understand that women's liberation and women's autonomy, it is without a doubt the guarantor for both a free Kurdistan and a free Syria in this context as well. You're on mute,
You are
Rojin.
muted.
Thank you, Elif. Yeah, I think from our perspective, or at least to say from democratic and federalist perspective, women liberation is the foundation for societal liberation. But the question is that how we're going to basically guarantee the existence of this gender emancipation that Kurdish women already achieved in Rojava. What's the guarantee for that? Kamal talked about that there is not much international guarantee, and we face many challenges. And theoretically, again speaking, the idea of coexistence of different groups and nations or ethnicities, or the idea of self-administration itself is based on spatial expansion. So now we see that expansion of the idea of democratic and federalism is shrinking actually. It pushed back to Kamishlu and Kobani at the moment. And this is another danger that we face. And perhaps we can later talk about this issue too. But Kamal, you talked about that Kurdish people made few miscalculation. And Elif, in the first question, actually made an interesting point, and that was that the Rojava revolution started prior to the emergence of ISIS in 2014, and that is a fact. The Rojava revolution started in 2012, like as the actual practice of democratic and federalism there, but this idea even goes back perhaps to late 1990s in Rojava and later within the establishment of PYD in 2003. But the emergence of ISIS brought new development, brought destruction, but at the same time brought some new forms of alliance between the Kurdish forces or Kurdish-led forces and the US. But this alliance never turned to become something strategical or something durable. It was always remained as tactical or temporary. And we see it in the remarks by Thomas Barak that the SDF forces usage basically expired, because now we have a functioning state, a functioning government in Damascus. Do you think the Kurdish people could have done otherwise to prevent this, to turn the alliances between the US and the SDF forces to something more substantial and durable? Or there wasn't anything that they could have done?
So there are limits for the SDF how to turn this tactical alliance into a more strategic alliance. Simply because, the United States will not have strategic alliances with the non-state actors. And non-state actors can play their role while there is turmoil and there is power rivalry between superpowers or regional powers or even nation states in the region. However, once those rivalries are settled, the non-state actors can be easily diminished, can be easily forgotten, or as the US has thrown the Kurds under the bus, as we say. So the Kurds in Rojava, they have been a non-state actor, and non-state actor, they should always understand how they can communicate with the regional powers and how they can survive, because as we know, like this survival mode was simply because the Kurdish leadership or the SDF was not able to turn the alliance from tactical into strategic. And that's not because of the SDF didn't want it. That's because the limits of the SDF and the Kurds are as such. And as we know, like this alliance between the SDF and the United States was mainly to contain ISIS. And also those forces that were against the Kurdish people in Syria, mainly Turkey. Turkey, we have to understand, Turkey is a NATO ally. And when it comes between the Kurds and the NATO ally, the NATO members will always choose Turkey over the Kurds. And to add some salt to the wound, like in 2022, so the Ukraine war started, US, Russia aggression started in Ukraine. And Turkey, for the international community, for the NATO, became even more important. And then in this situation, like Turkey was always able to have a bigger leverage, and was able always to block the formalization between the SDF and like the SDF's formalization into a broader strategic alliance with the international community. So somehow there was no path for the SDF to be internationally recognized. However, I believe the SDF and also the Kurdish leadership miscalculated. I understand they had to bet on international recognition because there was no other way. How can you, between all these four aggressive nations in the region, that you want to be politically recognized? The only way was somehow to be close to the international community, to try to bet, to gamble on the US and international support. However, they should have understood, especially when the Trump administration, okay, they didn't understand the first Trump administration, but they should have understood when Trump came back to power. So the Trump administration, the Trump ADs were very, very clear from the very beginning that the new Middle East is the Middle East of prosperity, not security. So their main focus was prosperity. Prosperity for them means how to these nations in the Middle East, the nation states, not the minorities, not the nation states, to prosper, how to stabilize, how to centrally strengthen their own status. At the same time, how to provide more political, geopolitical, and economic and energy interests for the United States, and especially for the United States. Sadly, the Kurdish geography, the Kurdish people in Rojava, they are not able to provide those interests geopolitically, energy-wise, and also politically, as Syria would be able to. Syria was a country considered as the backbone of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the only state in the region which was part of the so-called axis of resistance, or the Shia crescent, was Syria. Even Iraq was not, because Iraq is politically divided. But Syria, Bashar Assad had completely control of power. And also Syria was a path of the Islamic Republic of Iran to reach Palestine, or to reach Lebanon. And now to expand its proxy wars against Israel, against all the Iranian rivals, especially the United States interests, and also Israel. So the Kurdish people, they should have understood, the Kurdish leadership should have understood this current administration. They don't care about the Kurds. They don't care about the democracy. They don't care about Kurdish people have established, system and experiment in the northeast of Syria, where women are equal, where ecology is respected, where minority rights are respected, democracy is evolving in the region, and the model of SDF could be a model for the entire of the region, or of Syria. So we have seen already, like then the undemocratic ambitions of the new administration in the United States. So how to expect it from the United States the current administration, to establish democracy in Syria, where by itself they are not democratic in their own administration. It was completely different from 2003. So 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, it was one of the policies in Iraq was democratization of Iraq. So it was not like the US intervention in Syria. The US intervention was simply for containment of ISIS, or eradicating ISIS. And the choice of the Kurds, that the United States chose Kurds, not because they liked the Kurds, simply because the Kurds did war against the Islamist terrorists better than the Sunni Arabs that they were supported by Turkey and also Muslim Brotherhood, like the Qatar in the region. So I think at some point it was important to bet on the international recognition and bet on the United States to support you, to protect you. And we have seen the United States have not completely abandoned the Kurds, to be honest. But at some point, especially when we saw that Trump is celebrating Ahmad al-Shara, and there is a new arrangement, the regional order is reordering. There is a new arc of the Sunni arc in the region where Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also Muslim Brotherhood are coming together, where they are trying to, in which they are eyeing on Syria, so that on one side they use Syria against Israel, on the other side also to check the Iranian influence in the region. So I think at that time the Kurdish leadership should have understood, and they have tried, instead of protecting the entire administration, they have used the international community support and influence to reach an agreement, to reach a better agreement with the new administration, with the new leadership in Syria, in which finally they did that. So they used France, US, and also international community support to convince the new Syrian leadership to have a decent agreement between the Kurds and Syria. But to my understanding, in my opinion, the Kurdish leadership, they should have done like in January 2025, not in January 2026.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for that. What you just pictured or told us here is actually brings a big question about the feasibility of the idea of democratic federalism within a state-based planet that we have. And this brings me to another question for Seevan, and that's that, Seevan, the Kurdish people trying to establish very desirable form of coexistence based on self-government of the people themselves. But they're trying to do this in a time that we see the rise of far right globally. We see the rise of nationalism globally, and we even see this in Kurdistan right now, when Rojava's officials declared mobilization of the Kurdish people. We saw that the Kurdish people from different parts of Kurdistan, in northern Iraq, in Bashur, in Bakur, in southeast Turkey, they went to the borders of Rojava from different angles. We saw a huge mobilization among the Kurdish people in diaspora, and we heard many nationalistic sentiment or chants among this group. And for example, one slogan was like "Yeka Yeka, Geli Kurd Yeka, is one, Kurdish nation is one." And many now argue, looking at the Rojava's experiment and what happened in Rojava, many argue that perhaps a state-based nationalism is the only path for the achievement of Kurdish political existence. I want to ask you, what do you think about this line of thinking?
Yeah, actually, the very notion of nation state is very problematic. And political will of the Kurdish movements, be it PKK, KDP, KDPI, whoever, for the last at least 70 years, none of them directly ask for nation state per se, in a form that we have a nation state in the region, or those states that we call a nation state, like Turks. The Turkish state nowadays is being established based on one nation, one country, one flag, one even religion, one even sect within Sunnism, Hanafism, whatever. Kurds never ask for this one. And always we think, even in a best case, if there's a state should be there, it should be Kurdistan state, with the all mosaic that Kurdish territory and Kurdistan as a land, people can live, which never been per se fully Kurds. So what is happening in Turkey, that what we call it nüfus mübadelesi, or maybe exchange of population, never been thought in the Kurdish discourse. But what is now being promoted after these few weeks, that we can see that the project of Kurdish brotherhood with everybody is somehow diminish or shrink, and the notion of nation state could be maybe successful. Actually, it's very miscalculation or misreading for the reality of what is going on. Because even what is going on in Iraqi Kurdistan, the connection between Kurds and Arabs in a political way between Baghdad and Erbil is very much based on the nation brotherhood between nations. And even inside somewhere like Erbil or Suleimania, we can see this coexistence between Kurds and non-Kurds, even living inside the area when we call it Kurdistan, be it the immigrants from South Iraq or even the Arab people who they used to live there in some places like Kirkuk. I was asking more than 20 people from the last few weeks whether this demonstration, these kind of great unprecedented mobilization that have been seen in Kurdistan, what any ethnic kind of narratives or some kind of racist voices ever been raised by the people in Kurdistan? The answer was no. So Kurdish people, by essence, they don't want to be racist. They don't want to be something out of the idea of being together with others. But in the areas when predominantly Kurdish people live in, very easily those people who are minority can be accommodated. While on the other hand, when the place Kurdish people are minority, somewhere like Aleppo or even Baghdad or Damascus, we can see the different scenario. In this respect, I can see this not about nation state itself, because we can see even the people, the crisis of nations, even who they have so-called nation state. Maduro was having Venezuela as a nation state, but where is he now? In Ukraine, we have a big crisis in most of places, in 10 places in the world at the moment, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe even, we have a problem while all those nations, they have a state, or even they have so-called nation state, but still the crises are there. So in terms of Kurdish issue there and the new kind of amendment for the struggle, I think nothing essentially changed, and we cannot leave the principles of brotherhood between nations for two reasons. One, because Kurdish people, by their own ontological existence, they cannot be racist. No matter who are the states around or these groups, Sunni Muslims, Sunni Islamists, or Shia Islamists, Kurds cannot be racist, cannot be fascist. Thankfully, at least political will of Kurds are not allowed to be racist. And that's very good. Thanks for these 50 years of the education that is being growing up within the Kurdish liberation movement, that we cannot be racist and we don't want to be racist. And that's only good leverage we have, because if we couldn't be racist as Kurds, we're going to be weakest link as a racist people. And the strongest racist, the strongest fascist states around can easily get in what they are already doing. So I think in this respect, the ideology of confederalism or brotherhood between nations or between communities, I can say better, is intact, but in practice is being slightly shrunk and is being not defeated, but retreated somehow. But in future, we can see, due to the countless problems in the majority of Syrian society, especially in the very center of the Sunni conflict between the tribes and state, we can see that this idea should be slightly promoted as well. And that's what exactly did it, the project, Kurdish project, did it for the last 15 years, while they were obliged by supporting this status quo and managing this stability, but they were slowly trying to implement this idea. That's why we can see out of 12,000 people who are killed from SDF or martyred, about 5,000 of them are from Arab. And most of these kind of administration personnel who they were used to implementing these ideas, now they are leaving their own cities of Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, and Tabqa, and every places back to Hasaka and Qamishlo. So in this case, is not per se about the conflict between Arabs and Kurds or Kurds and non-Kurds. It's about fascism against pluralism. It's about democracy and grassroots implementation or centralist ideas, that ideology that is being implemented by Sham nowadays and in future. I think that we should make it clear in this respect, rather than exactly looking at what is going on even globally.
Thank you so much, Seevan. you just like made an essentialist argument in favor of Kurdish people, and what you're saying is it can be viewed problematic by some. By essence, you basically saying that the Kurdish people are democratic, not racist, and resisting fascism. We actually can say that whether a nation state or not a state for the Kurdish people, it's a matter of feasibility more. If we look at the real politics right now, which also, Kamal, what you described in your answer for the second question, it was about the feasibility of the idea of the democratic confederalism within a state-based like world order. And we have to think about that, have to think about how we're going to practice, actualize a progressive idea of coexistence based on like the recognition of self-determination of all the nations within this like state-based world order that has been like now, especially in the Middle East, going to take another like turn. And Elif, that brings me to the last question for you. When we talk about Rojava, Rojava is not detached from Middle East. So we know that post-October 7 event brought another political turmoil to the region. And we see its implication in Rojava. We see that how after post-October 7, the balances of power shifted in the region and gave like more weight to the HTS forces. They could easily topple down the Assad regime because Assad's partners were basically dealing with other issues in the region. And now it is like a question that Rojava's like fate, especially the political fate of Rojava, is going to have a broader implication for the region. For example, if Rojava could somehow survive and protect and preserve its self-administration system, that can also have an implication in other parts of Kurdistan, or even this idea to expand again itself to other parts of Syria. But at the same time, its collapse also can be viewed as a catastrophe for the region. We can easily see the rise of Islamist extremism and fascism, which is already growing in the Middle East. How do you like evaluate the situation? How do you think that Rojava's basically political fate is going to have a say in the future of the Middle East?
Thank you, Rojin. I mean, I guess I want to start by saying, firstly, it was really important to hear what both Kamal and Seevan had to say. And, you know, one of the points that Kamal made about, you know, particularly the US and so on, who, you know, that not caring about what Rojava represents in terms of its democracy and so on. I suppose I would like to go one step further than that and say they do care, but actually they care in terms of precisely because of what Rojava has represented, and therefore they're actually against it. And I think two things for me come to mind. Like the first is, you know, in the 80s, when the then Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher, famously said, "Tina, there is no alternative." You know, the projects and experiments and attempts like Rojava obviously is a big risk to what has become the quite, you know, ideological grounding of what the West has come to represent and also exported around the world. Also, even from the very, very beginning, you know, again, as Kamal said, despite the tactical military relationship between the international coalition led by the US and the Kurdish led forces, it was very, very clear that there was political differences from the very beginning. And I remember, I think it was in 2015, one of the envoys to Syria, like US envoys, it goes back to what Washington, and is at some Washington DC think tank event, and he's talking about his experience in Rojava and how he was taken around and so on. And he said something very interesting, and it was over a decade ago now, where he said, the Kurds, they're governing in their wake. So he recognized that there was a governance going on, and that the forces there were able to govern. And he says, there's some issues. For example, they lean a bit too much towards socialism, but the implication was that wasn't anything that the US couldn't deal with, as in, like, we'll fix them. Like, they're governing, but the way they govern is a bit of an issue because it's a little bit socialist. And that approach and that kind of understanding of what Rojava represents has remained from the perspective of the US, is that there is a form of governance there. There is actually a form of stability that has been formed through this experience and through this experiment, but actually the way they are doing it and the content of it is slightly an issue. And I would argue that it's precisely because it kind of breaks some of the claims that, the kind of when the turn of the times, let's call it, with the introduction of neoliberalism and so on, like, it kind of challenges that also, right? And I think, again, it was very interesting what Seevan said around, like, what the strength of the Kurdish people need to be in insisting on siblinghood. And I think, despite many people or some people trying to claim that, Rojava is in this mess because of its democratic confederalism, I think I would argue that Rojava has been able to defend itself because of what democratic confederalism entails. We can talk about the details of communes and assemblies and so on, but I think the ultimate core, one of the main core principles of it being that the whole of society is mobilized and organized, is what we've seen was therefore turn into the ability for thousands, tens of thousands of people to be able to flock to the streets, both across Rojava, but also in other parts of Kurdistan as well. And I think it's really important that we kind of think about that and think about, especially those who talk about, we must insist on an independent Kurdistan and nothing else, that when we, as 100 years later, after the Kurdish people were divided into 4 nation states, what kind of Kurdistan would we want, even if we were to aim for an independent Kurdistan? And I think this is where they kind of, this is where the conversation goes a little bit, awkward, I suppose I would say, because often the answer is it doesn't matter as long as it's a Kurdistan. But we're seeing where the closest the Kurdish people have got to independence is the experience of the Kurdistan regional government, right? And we're seeing there as well that, because the question of how and what kind of Kurdistan we want hasn't been very meaningfully explored. And we can talk about why and the limitations of it and so on, and what the forces in the Kurdistan region were kind of dealing with. But the point is that was never meaningfully explored. And we've seen in the last few decades the mass youth exodus from the Kurdistan region, and essentially the only people who are able to move back to the Kurdistan region are those who are of a very particular class position. Basically people who are already well off are able to go back to their countries. And the last point I just wanted to make is, I think, when we talk about the siblinghood of peoples, we also need to understand that that siblinghood and the insistence of that is going to be very crucial for the future of the region. And I think, I believe, and I think it's important that there is an insistence on self-reliance, but self-reliance does not have to be isolationism. And those who, advocate for an isolationist, independent Kurdistan also really, really do not understand the reality of the region. And when I say that, I don't mean that it's not even possible. That's another question, and that's another thing to explore. But also, the people who live on the land that we call Kurdistan, we call that Kurdistan maybe, but there's also other peoples who have lived there for hundreds of years who that territory means, you know, another land to them. And therefore, it's necessary that we insist on the siblinghood of people, so we are not recreating the problems that have got us as Kurdish people in here in the first place.
Thank you so much. Actually, we're running out of time, so I think I leave the third question for Kamal and for Seevan, because I see some people already raised their hands, so maybe they have also some questions. So it is good also to give them a chance to participate in our discussion. I see, yes, here. Yeah, yes, here. Saleh Bakr. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Thank you. So I have a question. So, like authoritarian, of course, democracy would be like the preferred system for any people, right? But authoritarians also are known to be able to mobilize more effectively and very quickly, and that's actually one of the arguments for that authoritarian governments make as opposed to democratic ones. Especially like in times of crises. For example, like during COVID, some authoritarian governments were able to answer more quickly and mobilize and change laws, procedures more quickly than, for example, say the US or some other European nations. Now the social components of Rojava especially is very complicated, and demographically is very like logged, which makes it even more difficult to do that. But like how would it survive with the idea of insisting on democracy, especially during times of war, and especially I mean in Rojava, especially during like in this region, that's almost always, you know, ravaged with conflict. And the other point is also for it's considered that the biggest threat for democracy is disinformation. Disinformation comes from media, right? And the most dominant media also in the region is the Qatari-backed one, unfortunately, which, you know, I would argue that most of the audience, especially the Arabs and the non-Kurds in Rojava, would be consuming. That's also like another big danger. So how do you think that these problems can be tackled? The disinformation and the insisting, let's say, despite all of it, you know, positive outcomes and points and desirable ones, it can be not very helpful during times of crises. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Salah, for this. I think we have two different like topic here. One is the insistence of the Kurdish people to try to survive based on the idea of democracy. Which one of you, especially Kamal and Seevan, which one of you want to take this? I think for Kamal, the idea of the misinformation that comes from that region, considering you are editor-in-chief of the Amargi, would be a better one. So Seevan, go ahead, and if you have anything to say about the question of the insistence of the Kurdish people on democracy as a mean to survive. How do you think about this?
Yeah, one of the criticism that can be actually during the 12 years, I can say 12, not from 2012, from 2015, or I can say of the self-administration in Rojava and northeast Syria, I can say, was imposing democracy by force in the society that people cannot adapt or get used to a democracy. But that was because we are in the war zone. We cannot easily even spend 20 minutes, not 20 weeks, 20 minutes without threatening by the Turkish state and its drones for every individual. Even Turkish state with the drones coming even 300 kilometers to the south Kurdistan to kill one of the individuals who are very crucial in the Rojava administration, at least ideologically. So in this case, resistance is very difficult in the war zone. That's one. Second, the society that are not get used to through the very long-term educational system and bit by bit to make democracy as a custom, as a kind of normal daily life of the people, is not easy to implement democracy. And that's the only kind of leverage that Rojava administration can show to the international community to say, look, we are different. Please recognize us. Yes, church are respected in Qamishlo, while the church in Damascus can be burned. And even this guy who now his name is Murhab Abi Qasra, who is the Minister of Interior, there's a big footage that he's breaking down the statue of the Maria. So this is very big differences, and the only leverage that you can see as a matter of resistance and survival. For the last 15 years, despite all these sacrifices, including what I just said as a criticism, imposing democracy by force in this society still was part of the very almost impossible mission to be done. So once again, the resistance is still continued, but what we saw in the last 3 weeks is the very nationhood mobilization that this entity, despite all the limitations, is not only belong to the people in Rojava, it belongs to every freedom seekers in the world, but very concentrated on majority, almost vast majority of the Kurdish people across the world in 4 parts and in diaspora. So that's one of the main pillar of the resistance that from now on, Kurdish administration and Rojava administration, I can say, still I can call it administration, I don't say past one, can resist and can continue and build on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seevan. What you just mentioned, I saw a quote by Fawza Youssef, one of the female officials of Rojava within the PYD leadership, and she was saying that unfortunately there is no space for ethic in politics today, and ethic is one important pillar of Kurdish politics in Rojava, and that shows us the challenges that Rojava faces, and that imposing democracy or even progressive ideas based on force is a big question that has a history of Jacobin movement. Should we impose even progressive idea based with force, or just let the people themselves freely to decide? Kamal, go ahead with the question of misinformation.
Yes, so thanks, Salah, for the question, and I think it's very important point to highlight here. Misinformation and disinformation is one of the big problems in the Middle East, and that's simply because the media is not free in the Middle East, and Middle East one of the most unfree region in the entire world. And Saudi Arabia is one of the very popular countries that doesn't like free media and free journalists. We know about the case of Jamal Khashoggi. And it was interesting until recently, Saudi Arabia was, through its media, was supporting Rojava. And especially, they were even celebrating the women fighters in Rojava. However, after things changed, and then Al Hadath and Al Arabiya, the other Saudi Arabia media, they became very aggressive to the Kurdish administration in Rojava. Put aside Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is very much clear. They have always been Muslim Brotherhood supporting Muslim Brotherhood, and also SNA, partly because of Turkey, partly because they are funding. They have been funding those extremist Islamist groups. But even how changes in the geopolitical arena in the region also changes the media in the region. And that's because the media is funded and controlled and used by the states in the region. However, it's not only the Arab media, but also the international media as well. Until recently, they have always had like bias and prejudice against the Kurds, and they have always been biased biased against the Kurdish freedom movement. And we saw from one of the very respectful German media outlets, Der Spiegel, in which everyone agrees, even the Syrian Arab Army agrees that this guy has cut the braid of a Kurdish woman fighter, and that's why he has been put under arrest by the Syrian Arab Army. But Der Spiegel is rejecting that. The Kurds are using this to propaganda to dehumanize the Syrian Arab Army, etc. However, we can always complain about other media outlets. We can complain about media of others, but we should also reflect it, especially during these times, why the Kurdish media has been a failure, why the Kurds have not been able to establish an English media. Thankfully, now we have the Amargi. I hope we can do something, but still we are also struggling, and we are very, a new startup, and we need support from our friends, financially, spiritually, emotionally, etc., politically, etc. However, we have to criticize ourselves, and especially the Kurdish freedom movement, be in Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, or in Rojava. Look what's happening in Rojava, what's happening in Iran. But the Kurdish political parties, even the activists and the intellectuals, they don't have a platform where they can use the Kurdish grievances and address those problems and misinformation and disinformation by the monarchists. And that's why it's time for us, the Kurds, reflect it, and especially when the dust is settled down, and also to criticize ourselves. Because without criticizing ourselves, which is the hardest thing to do, we can always complain and criticize others. And we need a free media, and also also within our communities, to support media, to also give a better space for the journalists to speak and to criticize. And within the Kurdish movement, within the Kurdish communities elsewhere, here in the diaspora as well, the Kurds do not only need the media to express themselves, to address their grievances, but also to criticize their own leadership. We talked about the miscalculations in Rojava. If we had a better media landscape in Kurdistan, also elsewhere in diaspora, to have a few think tanks, to do research about the United States, international community, international politics, we could have criticized the self-administration better. But now I can easily criticize. Of course, I criticize them a lot during our talk, but it's easy to criticize from this position. But we should also have a sort of policy briefs. We should have done research. We should have done research about the new administration. Who are the new administration in U.S. Trump administration? Who are they? Who are the ones who are being appointed to the Middle East, whether they are close to us or not? What interests they have, etc., etc. So the other media, they are doing this, and they are also doing everything, also in social media, to demonize the Kurdish. Not only the Kurdish freedom movement or the Kurdish regions, but also the Kurdish people. Interestingly, my last point, Bakhtir Ali has written a very interesting article about how this, the Arab media, all in a sudden, neo-fascist sentiments against the Kurdish people have mobilized within the Arab Sunni media. I think, this is how we have to counter those arguments that are dehumanizing the Kurdish people.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for that. I think we came to the end of our discussion, but before that, we have one question in our chat box written by one of the Jîna Academy's students from Rojava. And to summarize the question is that what you guys think about the America's plan about Turkish and Arab fascism? What the US is going to do about it? Is doing to prepare a war against this, or just threatening them? That's the question. Elif, would you
Elif,
like to go
perhaps?
ahead and say something about this?
I may.
Okay.
I think. Sorry, Elif.
Yeah, please.
I think this question comes from the deepest anxieties that many people in Rojava in Iran are experiencing these days. And there is a lot of noise, a lot of misinformation, as you talked about. And thank you so much for those really brilliant discussions. And these deep anxieties, we observers, writers, journalists, academics outside that are kind of connected with this sphere, we have, like many people, we have become numb. I always tell my friends in Canada that what is happening in the region, if it were to happen in one village, let alone in the whole country of Canada, uh, Canadian public would have declared apocalypse, would have declared the end of the world, the end of life, the end of everything that we know. And this normalization of death, the normalization of war, normalization of destruction, misery, I think this question comes from that very deep uh, level of anxiety and uh, anguish, to be honest, if I may, and this numbness that many people think if an attack happens against Iran, that would resolve a lot of problems. And if that could be some sort of alternative against what we were doing, people were doing in Rojava, and we were part of the university system, that you have to do it slowly. And like in the case of universities, it has to be classroom by classroom, student by student, assignment by assignment, meeting by meeting, a lot of work that needs labor, that needs love, that needs care. And we have come to this point that we do all of that, and then boom, a political change, a geopolitical, geostrategic change happens, and everything basically disappears. So then we kind of conclude that maybe war is solution, war is alternative. And in my opinion, being unaware of and being numb to understand that we are just getting deeper and deeper in the crisis that have engulfed the whole region and our people for the past, God knows, few decades.
Thanks, Sardar. Please, yeah, Kamal, go ahead.
Can I add one more sentence to this, what
Go ahead.
Sardar said? Thanks for intervention. But what could I say is just that we have to understand international politics is a rational operational activity, it's not a moral activity. So we should never expect it from the United States or the international community to come and fight Turkish, Arab, and Persian fascism. Or it's something that we have to do by ourselves. And I think the Kurds have done quite well, although some people also try to like some Kurds, especially some ethno-nationalists, think that we can only fight fascism with Kurdish fascism. But I think it's a huge mistake. We have to fight fascism with a democratic paradigm that the Kurds own now, and I think that's beautiful of the Kurdish people, as Seevan said earlier, that although some want to be racist, but the majority do not want to be racist and fascist, and the struggle should be continuing.
Thank you so much for this. We have another question, but I would like also to add one just small thought on this. And this is that sometimes we also, as some like observers, some like writers, we actually overestimate the power of the states, and we mostly talk about their role and their plan, their strategy, and we underestimate the power of the people. We just saw it in Rojava that you mentioned, Kamal, that kind of Rojava passed existential threat because of the this level of solidarity we saw among at least Kurdish people. So that's the power of powerless. And we need to think about this, that with this forming especially transnational solidarity, we can become powerful too. And that power can confront this power which comes from the states. And that's unfortunately often underestimated. But another question from, again, our students from the Jîna Academy, and perhaps this is the last question. It says, what do you have to do under international law as a court at this moment? Like, is there something that the Kurdish people can do within the framework of international law to secure, for example, something for Rojava? Now we see that Ahmed al-Shara had a decree signed that, okay, I'm going to recognize the Kurdish language as a national language. Is there something that the Kurdish people to refer to within the international law to secure that or achieve some sort of guarantee?
I mean, I can just say a few things about this, because there's obviously many precedents and much in international law. But I think we only have to look at the past 2 years where, not very far from our lands, that there was a genocide for 2 years, and the complete inability of all international institutions to actually stop it. Now, it's not that some of them weren't mobilized and so on, but I think it's also, what the UN once promised to be, it's clearly no longer able to be. Like in no way, and it hasn't been able to be, particularly at the it's from the start of the 21st century, like from the shifting of the nation states to a focus on security and the so-called war on terror of particularly in the West, the United Nations, no longer was able to fulfill the promise actually that it had, particularly in the era of post-colonial struggle and so on. So that's very clear. And this doesn't mean that certain mechanisms cannot be activated, but I think ultimately, and as we've heard from Kamal, Seevan, and Sardar, and you too, Rojin, has said, that it's about the ability to self-organize and self-reliance. And crucially, this doesn't mean isolationism, right? Understanding that we have no choice but to build bridges in our region to shape our region in a more democratic way against all the plans and intentions for the redesign, the attempts that we're seeing. And we can already see this in over a year, from the approach of Shara. We can see in his focus on almost exclusively seeking external legitimacy over internal. It's not that he has the support of the Syrian people. I'm not even just talking about the Kurds. It's not that he has the support of people across Syria. He doesn't. He has the support of a very tiny minority, actually, on the scale of Syria. The so-called election that they held was, about 5,000 people voted because he focused on external legitimacy. And when we talk about external legitimacy in this context, it's about the legitimacy of imperial interests, particularly for the future of the exploitation of Syria's resources. This is also why one of the first statements that Shara made was the promise that Syria's new future economy will be a privatized neoliberal economy. So in terms of what, therefore, like, can we rely on others? Can international institutions, can the US or any other power save us from Turkish or Arab or the fascism of like the Iranian regime? The answer is no, because a democratic region doesn't go very well with exploitation, right? So the answer is no. It doesn't mean certain things cannot be pushed. These aren't all impossibilities, but it's also understanding the realities in which we're operating, and therefore to shape how we approach things accordingly.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that. I think we'll leave it here. Seevan, would you like to add something, or? Yeah, okay, we'll leave it here. On behalf of the Jîna Academy, I would like to thank you all. Thank you for being with us, especially our attendees. Thank you to our panelists. It was great discussion, and please keep an eye on Jîna Academy's website and Jîna Academy's Instagram and X account. We're going to upload later some excerpts of this video, and also we're going to put some more information about our future discussion. Thank you so much again.
Alex Vaz, thank you so much.
Thank you everyone.
I appreciate it.
Evar baş.
Evar baş.
You're right.